The doors of the great hall slammed open, and every torch in the room flickered, as if the wind itself had come to witness the moment. Elara stood alone on the marble floor, her hands trembling at her sides, while hundreds of eyes bore into her from every corner of the palace. Alpha King Draven stood on the raised platform above her, his jaw tight, his eyes cold as frost over a winter lake. The moon goddess had chosen them as mates. Everyone in the kingdom of Veremore knew it. The silver mark on Elara's wrist had appeared the night of the eclipse, matching the one hidden beneath the king's sleeve. But Draven had not come to accept her. He had come to end it. "I reject this bond," he said, his voice echoing through the stone hall like a blade cutting through silence. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Nobles exchanged glances. Somewhere near the back, a woman covered her mouth in shock. Elara felt her knees weaken, but she refused to fall. She had grown up in Thornhollow, a small pack on the edge of the kingdom, where Omegas were often overlooked and rarely given a voice. She had dreamed of proving herself worthy, of showing the court that an Omega could stand as tall as any Alpha. Instead, she was being cast aside in front of the very people she had hoped to earn respect from. "Your Majesty," she said quietly, though her voice cracked despite her effort to remain steady. "The bond was not something either of us chose, but it was given to us. Rejecting it does not erase what the goddess has written." Draven's eyes flickered, just for a moment, something unreadable passing through them. But he masked it quickly, straightening his shoulders and turning his gaze toward the crowd instead of her. "The kingdom needs strength, not sentiment," he announced. "A political alliance with House Ashford will secure our borders and our future. Lady Seraphine will stand beside me as queen." The name landed like a physical blow. Elara had heard whispers of Seraphine, the daughter of a powerful Alpha family from the Northern Territories, known for her sharp tongue and sharper ambitions. She was beautiful, cunning, and calculating, everything a king's advisors believed a queen should be. Elara, on the other hand, was quiet, careful, and unremarkable in the eyes of the court. She had known, deep down, that this outcome was possible. But knowing something might happen, and watching it happen in front of an entire kingdom, were two very different kinds of pain. She did not cry. She refused to give them that satisfaction. Instead, she lifted her chin, met Draven's eyes one final time, and said the only thing she had left to offer. "Then I release you as well, my king. May your choice bring you everything you believe you deserve." Something shifted in Draven's expression at those words, a flicker of doubt, perhaps even regret, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. He turned away first, retreating to his throne, as if the matter had already been settled and forgotten. The court began to murmur again, already moving on to whispers about the upcoming wedding, about Seraphine's gowns, about the alliance that would reshape the kingdom's borders. Nobody seemed to notice that Elara remained standing in the center of the hall, alone, invisible now that her purpose in the ceremony had ended. She walked out of the palace that night, without a word to anyone. The guards at the gate barely looked at her, assuming she was simply another servant, returning to her quarters. She did not go to her quarters. She walked past the outer wall, past the training grounds, past the stables where the royal wolves slept in their pens, and did not stop until the palace lights had faded into the distance behind her. Somewhere behind those walls, in the private chambers reserved for the king, Draven paced back and forth, his wolf snarling beneath his skin, restless and furious, for reasons he refused to name. He told himself the decision had been necessary. He told himself that duty mattered more than a bond he had not asked for. He told himself many things that night, but none of them eased the strange hollow feeling spreading through his chest, as though something vital had been carved out of him and taken far away. By morning, the palace was already buzzing with talk of the wedding preparations. Servants rushed through the halls carrying bolts of silk and crates of imported flowers. Advisors gathered in the war room to discuss trade agreements tied to the alliance with House Ashford. Everything moved forward, as though the previous night's ceremony had simply been a formality, a necessary step to clear the path for the king's true plans. It was General Kale who first noticed something was wrong. He had served Draven since childhood, first as a training partner, later as his most trusted commander. Kale made his way to the servants' quarters that morning, intending to check on Elara, whom he had always treated with quiet respect, unlike most of the court. When he knocked on her door and received no answer, he pushed it open to find the room empty. Her belongings were untouched. Her cloak still hung on its hook, but she was gone. He searched the palace grounds first, thinking perhaps she had simply gone for a walk to clear her head after the humiliation of the previous night. When he found no trace of her near the gardens or the training fields, he expanded his search to the outer wall, questioning the guards on duty. None of them recalled seeing her leave. There was no scent trail for the trackers to follow, which struck Kale as deeply unusual. Omegas were not known for masking their scent, especially not untrained ones from small border packs. He brought the news to Draven that afternoon, finding the king in his private study, staring at a map of the kingdom's territories without truly seeing it. "She's gone," Kale said simply. "No trace, no scent. It's as if she vanished into thin air." Draven's hand tightened around the edge of his desk. "She probably returned to Thornhollow. Send a rider to confirm it, and be done with the matter." "I already sent word this morning," Kale replied. "Her family has not seen her. They didn't even know the ceremony had taken place until my messenger arrived." For the first time since the rejection ceremony, something close to alarm crossed Draven's face. He dismissed it quickly, standing and moving toward the window, as though the matter no longer concerned him. "She will turn up somewhere. Omegas do not simply disappear, Kale. Focus your attention on securing the northern border instead. The alliance with House Ashford depends on stability, not chasing after someone who has already been dismissed from court." Kale studied his king for a long moment before nodding and leaving the room, though doubt lingered heavily in his chest. He had fought beside Draven for over a decade, and knew him well enough to recognize when something troubled him deeply, no matter how well he tried to hide it behind a mask of indifference. That night, as Draven attempted to sleep, his wolf stirred restlessly beneath his skin, pulling at him with an urgency he had never experienced before. He dreamed of silver eyes staring back at him from the darkness, of a voice calling his name from somewhere far beyond the palace walls. He woke drenched in sweat, his heart pounding, and told himself it meant nothing. Far from the palace, deep within the Ashwood forest that bordered the kingdom's southern edge, Ilara sat beside a small fire she had built, with hands that no longer trembled. The forest had always frightened the villagers of Thornhollow, filled with old stories of spirits and forgotten magic that predated even the founding of Vairmore. But Ilara felt no fear as she watched the flames dance against the darkness. For the first time in her life, she felt something else entirely: freedom. She touched the silver mark on her wrist, the one that had bound her to a king who did not want her, and felt a strange warmth pulse beneath her skin, different from before, sharper somehow, as if the rejection had not broken the bond but changed its shape into something neither of them yet understood. A soft rustling sounded from the tree line, and Ilara turned to see a pair of golden eyes watching her from the shadows. A wolf emerged slowly, larger than any she had seen among the palace guard, its fur a deep charcoal gray that seemed to absorb the firelight rather than reflect it. She should have been afraid. Instead, she felt an unexpected calm settle over her, as though the creature had come not to threaten her, but to accompany her. "I have nowhere left to go," she said softly to the wolf, unsure why she spoke aloud at all. "But I refuse to spend my life waiting for someone who has already made his choice clear." The wolf lowered itself to the ground beside her, resting its great head near her feet, and for reasons she could not explain, tears finally slipped down her cheeks, not from sorrow, but from something closer to release. She had spent her entire life trying to earn a place in a world that had already decided she did not belong. Perhaps it was time to build a place of her own instead. Back within the palace, preparations for the royal wedding continued without pause. Seraphine arrived 3 days later with an entourage of nearly 50 attendants, her presence commanding the attention of every hall she walked through. She was every bit as striking as the rumors suggested, with sharp emerald eyes and a confidence that bordered on arrogance. She greeted Draven with practiced grace, though even she seemed to notice the distance in his gaze, the way his attention drifted elsewhere during their formal introduction. "You seem distracted, my king," she remarked, as they walked together through the palace gardens later that evening, attendants trailing several steps behind them. "Merely tired," Draven replied. "The affairs of the kingdom require constant attention." Seraphine studied him carefully, her sharp mind already piecing together fragments of information she had gathered from the whispers among the staff. She had heard about the Omega who vanished the same night the rejection ceremony took place, and though she said nothing of it directly, she filed the information away for later use. A queen who understood her husband's weaknesses held far more power than one who remained blind to them. As the days passed, strange occurrences began troubling the palace. Flowers meant for the wedding decorations wilted within hours of being cut, despite being kept in fresh water. Several of the kitchen staff fell ill with a fever that the palace healers could not explain or cure. The royal wolves in the stables grew restless at night, howling at nothing visible, refusing to settle even under the watch of experienced handlers. The palace healer, an elderly woman named Beatrice who had served 3 generations of the royal family, grew increasingly concerned, though she kept her worries private, fearing what conclusions might be drawn if she spoke them aloud. Draven dismissed each incident as coincidence, refusing to entertain the old superstitions his advisors occasionally whispered about broken bonds, carrying consequences beyond simple heartbreak. He had been raised to believe that duty and strength mattered more than ancient stories meant to frighten children. Yet late at night, alone in his chambers, he found himself standing at the window overlooking the southern forest, more often than he cared to admit, searching the darkness for something he could not name. Cale continued his quiet investigation despite the king's dismissal of the matter. He questioned traders passing through the capital, sent inquiries to neighboring packs, and even consulted with Beatrice about the old stories surrounding rejected mate bonds. What he learned troubled him deeply. According to the oldest texts in the palace library, a mate bond rejected by an alpha king did not simply disappear. It transformed, seeking balance, in ways that could either strengthen or destroy the kingdom, depending on how the bond resolved itself. Cale chose not to share this information with Draven just yet, uncertain how his king would react, but he began paying closer attention to every report arriving from the border territories, searching for any sign that might explain the growing unrest spreading quietly through the realm. Meanwhile, deep within Ashwood Forest, Elara continued walking southward, following no particular path, guided instead by an instinct she had never trusted before that night. The charcoal wolf remained by her side, never straying far, as though bound to her by some invisible thread. She began to notice changes within herself as the days passed. Her senses sharpened. She could hear conversations from farther away than should have been possible. She could smell rain approaching hours before the first clouds appeared on the horizon. Most strikingly, small animals that once would have fled from her presence now approached without fear, as though recognizing something in her they trusted instinctively. She eventually came upon a small village, nestled at the edge of the forest, far removed from the influence of the capital and its politics. The villagers, wary of strangers at first, softened when Elara offered to help tend to a young boy, suffering from a severe fever that the local healer had struggled to treat for days. She knelt beside him, placed her palm gently against his forehead, and felt warmth flow from her hand into his small body, the fever breaking within hours, in a manner that left the village healer speechless with disbelief. Word spread quickly after that, as word tends to do in small communities desperate for any source of hope. Within weeks, people from neighboring villages began arriving, seeking her help for illnesses that had resisted every other remedy. Elara never asked for payment, never sought recognition, and yet her reputation grew regardless, carried along trade routes and whispered between travelers who had witnessed her gift firsthand. She became known simply as the woman with silver eyes, a healer who commanded the loyalty of wild wolves, without ever raising her voice or claiming a single title. She did not know that these same rumors would eventually reach the capital, carried by merchants and travelers passing through the palace gates. She did not know that a general still loyal to a king who had wronged her would soon begin connecting the pieces of a mystery that threatened to unravel everything the kingdom of Veremore had built. All she knew was that for the first time in her life, she had found a purpose entirely her own, built not from a bond forced upon her by fate, but from choices she had made freely, standing on her own 2 feet, in a world that had once told her she did not matter. As autumn deepened and the wedding between Draven and Seraphine drew closer, the kingdom of Veremore stood at the edge of change neither its king nor its people yet understood. Somewhere beyond the southern forest, a rejected Omega had begun building a quiet power of her own, unaware of how deeply her absence had already begun to shake the foundations of the throne she had once been asked to share. The wedding preparations at the palace had reached a fevered pace, with seamstresses working through the night to finish Seraphine's gown, and the royal kitchens preparing feasts that would feed thousands of guests traveling from every corner of the kingdom. Draven moved through the days like a man performing a role written by someone else, attending council meetings, approving trade agreements, and standing beside Seraphine during public appearances, all while a quiet unease continued to gnaw at the edges of his mind. Seraphine noticed his detachment more with each passing week. She had grown up in a household where marriages were arranged for strategic advantage rather than affection, so she had not expected passion from her union with Draven. Still, she had expected respect, engagement, perhaps even friendship built over time. Instead, she found herself competing against a silence she could not name, a distance in her betrothed that no amount of charm or conversation seemed able to close. "You barely look at me during the feasts," she said one evening as they stood together on the palace balcony, overlooking the training grounds below. "The court will notice, if they haven't already." "I have a kingdom to manage," Draven replied, his tone clipped. "Forgive me, if my attention is divided." Seraphine studied him carefully, her sharp instincts recognizing that his distraction went far deeper than the ordinary pressures of ruling a kingdom. She had heard the servants whispering about the healer, with silver eyes, living somewhere in the southern territories, about the wolves who followed her without command, about the strange coincidence of her rise, beginning the very night the Omega vanished from the palace. Seraphine was not foolish enough to dismiss these rumors as idle gossip. She recognized the shape of a threat when she saw one, even one wrapped in kindness and healing rather than open confrontation. That night, Draven experienced the most vivid dream yet. He stood in a forest clearing, bathed in silver moonlight, and across from him stood Elara, her eyes glowing faintly, a wolf resting calmly at her side. She did not speak. She simply watched him, with an expression that held neither anger nor forgiveness, only quiet distance, as though she had already moved beyond needing anything from him at all. He woke gasping, his chest tight, his wolf howling beneath his skin, with a longing so fierce it left him shaking. He rose before dawn and walked to the training grounds alone, hoping physical exertion might quiet the storm building inside him. Kale found him there an hour later, sparring against a wooden training post, with far more force than the exercise required. "You should rest," Kale said, watching his king strike the post again and again. "The wedding is in 3 weeks. The court expects you rested and composed." "I am composed," Draven snapped, though the crack in the wooden post beneath his fist suggested otherwise. Kale crossed his arms and studied his old friend carefully. They had trained together since boyhood, had fought side by side in border skirmishes, had shared victories and losses that shaped the men they had become. Kale understood Draven better than nearly anyone else in the kingdom, which was precisely why he chose that moment to finally speak the truth he had been holding back for weeks. "There have been reports," Kale said carefully, "of unrest along the southern border. 3 minor packs have refused to send their seasonal tribute this year. 2 others have stopped responding to messages from the capital entirely." Draven lowered his fists, turning to face his general with a sharp look. "Since when?" "The refusals began roughly a month ago," Kale answered. Around the same time, strange rumors started spreading about a healer in the southern territories, who commands wolves without a pack of her own. The color drained slightly from Draven's face, though he quickly masked it with practiced control. "You believe these 2 events are connected?" "I believe," Kale said carefully, choosing his words with the precision of a man who had spent weeks considering this exact conversation, "that a mate bond, rejected by a king, carries weight beyond personal matters. The old texts speak of it. A king's strength has always been tied to the strength of his bond. If that bond has not simply broken, but shifted its power elsewhere, it would explain both the healer's growing influence and the unrest along our borders." Draven said nothing for a long moment, staring out across the training grounds toward the distant tree line of the southern forest, invisible from this distance, but present nonetheless in the back of his mind, the way it had been present every night since Elara's disappearance. "The old texts are superstition," he finally said, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Perhaps," Kale replied, "or perhaps they are truths our ancestors understood better than we do now, truths we have grown too comfortable to remember." Draven did not respond directly, instead ordering Kale to increase patrols along the southern border and to gather more concrete information about the packs refusing tribute before drawing further conclusions. Kale agreed, though he left the training grounds with a growing certainty that his king already suspected the truth and simply refused to admit it aloud. Over the following days, additional reports arrived from the border territories, each one more troubling than the last. A 4th pack severed communication with the capital. Merchants traveling through the southern trade routes reported increasingly organized gatherings around the village, where the silver-eyed healer resided, with representatives from distant packs traveling great distances simply to seek her counsel or her healing touch. Most concerning of all, several packs that had remained loyal to the crown for generations began quietly relocating their borders closer to her territory, as though positioning themselves beneath a new form of protection they trusted more than the king's authority. Beatrice, the palace healer, finally approached Draven directly after weeks of watching the strange occurrences within the palace continue to worsen. The flowers meant for wedding decorations had begun wilting the moment they were cut, no matter the care taken to preserve them. Several more members of the kitchen staff had fallen ill with fevers that resisted every remedy in her considerable knowledge. The royal wolves refused to settle at night, their restless howling audible even from the farthest wings of the palace. "Your Majesty," Beatrice said, finding him alone in his study late one evening, "I have served this family for over 30 years, through your father's reign and now through yours. I have never witnessed occurrences such as these, not even during the border conflicts of your father's time." "Speak plainly, Beatrice," Draven said, setting down the documents he had been reviewing. "You have never been one to dance around difficult truths." "The kingdom is unwell," she said simply. "Not merely the crops or the weather, though those too have shown troubling signs this season. The kingdom itself, its foundation, feels unsteady in a way I cannot fully explain through medicine or reason alone. I believe it began the night of the rejection ceremony, and I believe it will continue worsening until the matter is resolved, one way or another." Draven remained silent for a long moment, his hands clasped tightly before him. "And what would you have me do, Beatrice? The alliance with House Ashford has already been announced. Canceling the wedding now would embarrass both kingdoms and likely provoke conflict rather than prevent it." "I cannot tell you what choice to make, Your Majesty," Beatrice said gently. "I can only tell you what I have observed, and trust that you are wise enough to understand its meaning." She left him alone with those words, and Draven sat in silence, long after she had gone, staring at the flickering candle on his desk without truly seeing it. For the first time since the rejection ceremony, he allowed himself to fully consider the possibility that his decision had been a mistake, not merely a difficult but necessary choice, but a genuine error that now threatened everything he had sworn to protect. The following morning, Seraphine requested a private audience with Draven, having spent the previous evening gathering information of her own through her network of attendants and informants scattered throughout the palace staff. She found him in the throne room, reviewing reports from the southern border with an expression more troubled than she had seen from him since her arrival. "I know about the Omega," she said without preamble, closing the heavy doors behind her to ensure privacy. "I know about the healer in the south, and I am not foolish enough to believe the timing is mere coincidence." Draven set down the report slowly, meeting her gaze directly, for perhaps the first time since her arrival at the palace. "What is it you wish to say, Lady Seraphine?" "I wish to say that I did not travel to this kingdom to marry a man whose heart and whose kingdom's stability belonged to someone else," she replied, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. "House Ashford agreed to this alliance because a strong union between our territories benefits us both. But an alliance built upon a fractured foundation benefits no one, least of all me." Her honesty surprised him, cutting through the careful diplomacy that had characterized their every previous interaction. "The bond was rejected for reasons of duty," he said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "Ilara understood the necessity of the alliance our marriage represents." "Did she?" Seraphine asked, arching an eyebrow. "Or did she simply have no power to refuse a king's decision, regardless of how she truly felt about it? There is a difference between understanding necessity and being given no choice but to accept it." Draven had no answer for that, and Seraphine, recognizing that her point had landed with the weight she intended, continued speaking. "I do not say this to shame you, Your Majesty. I say it because I believe you already sense the truth of what is happening to your kingdom, and I would rather face that truth directly than watch us both walk into a marriage that satisfies no one and solves nothing." She left him alone after that conversation, her footsteps echoing through the throne room as she departed, leaving Draven to sit with thoughts he had spent weeks avoiding. That night, his wolf refused to settle entirely, pacing beneath his skin with an urgency that made sleep nearly impossible. He dreamed again of the forest clearing, of silver eyes watching him from a distance that felt simultaneously close and impossibly far. And this time, when he woke, he did not simply dismiss the dream as meaningless. He rose before dawn once more, but this time, instead of retreating to the training grounds, he made his way to the palace library, searching through the oldest texts available for any mention of rejected mate bonds and their consequences upon a kingdom's stability. What he found confirmed everything Kale and Beatrice had suggested, described in language far more direct than he had expected from ancient scholars. A king's authority, the texts explained, drew strength not merely from military might or political alliance, but from the balance of the bonds that anchored him to the land and its people. A rejected bond did not simply vanish. It sought resolution, often manifesting as instability within the kingdom itself, until the matter was properly addressed, one way or another. By the time morning light filtered through the library windows, Draven understood with growing certainty that the unrest spreading through his borders, the strange illnesses plaguing his palace, and the restlessness of his own wolf were not separate misfortunes occurring by chance. They were symptoms of a single wound, one he had inflicted himself the night he stood before his entire court and rejected the bond the moon goddess herself had chosen for him. He closed the ancient text slowly, staring at the rising sun through the library window, and for the first time since that fateful night, allowed himself to fully acknowledge the depth of the mistake he had made. News of the palace's troubles began spreading beyond its walls faster than Draven's advisors could contain it. Traveling merchants carried stories of wilting gardens and restless wolves to every town along the trade routes, and by the time the tales reached the southern territories, they had grown into something closer to legend. Villagers spoke in hushed voices of a curse settling over the capital, a punishment sent by the moon goddess herself for the king's rejection of his true mate. Whether the stories were exaggerated mattered little. What mattered was that people believed them, and belief alone was enough to shake loyalties that had once seemed unbreakable. In the small village where Alara had settled, life had changed dramatically in the weeks since her arrival. What had once been a quiet farming community now buzzed with activity, as visitors arrived daily, seeking her help, her counsel, or simply the chance to see for themselves the woman the wolves seemed to answer to without command. She had not sought this attention. She had only wanted a place to rebuild her life away from the palace that had discarded her. But her gift for healing, combined with the calm authority she carried without even trying, drew people to her the way rivers are drawn toward the sea. A young man named Corwin, the son of a modest trader from a neighboring village, had become one of her most devoted helpers, assisting with the growing number of visitors and organizing the small clinic she had established near the village center. He had arrived months earlier seeking treatment for a wound that refused to heal, and after Alara's care restored him fully within days, he chose to stay, grateful and eager to repay her kindness through service. Another group arrived this morning, Corwin told her one afternoon, as she finished tending to an elderly farmer suffering from joint pain that had plagued him for years. Representatives from the Thornwood Pack, I believe. They say they've traveled nearly a week to reach us. Alara straightened, wiping her hands on a cloth as she considered his words. What do they want? The same thing most of them want, Corwin replied. Guidance, protection. Some of them speak of pledging loyalty to you directly, rather than continuing to send tribute to the capital. The words settled uneasily in Alara's chest. She had never intended to build anything resembling political power. She had simply wanted to help those who came to her in need, using whatever strange new abilities had awakened within her since that painful night at the palace. But she understood enough about the world to recognize the danger in what was happening. A kingdom's stability depended on loyalty flowing toward its throne, and every pack that turned toward her instead represented a crack widening in a foundation, already weakened by Draven's decision. She agreed to meet with the Thornwood representatives that evening, listening carefully as they explained their reasons for seeking her out. Their pack had suffered a harsh season, their crops failing despite normal weather patterns, their hunting grounds strangely barren of game that should have been plentiful. Their alpha, an older man named Garrick, believed the troubles stemmed from the same imbalance affecting the capital, and he had traveled personally to ask for Alara's blessing, believing it might restore harmony to his lands. I am not a queen, Alara told him honestly, choosing her words with care. I hold no throne, no army, no formal authority over any territory. Whatever you believe I can offer you, I fear it may not be what you truly need. With respect, Garrick replied, his weathered face serious. The goddess chose you for a reason none of us fully understand yet. The land itself seems to recognize your presence, even if the king refused to. My people are suffering, and I have exhausted every other option available to me. If there is even a chance your presence might restore balance to our territory, I am willing to pledge whatever loyalty you require in exchange." Elara felt the weight of his words pressing against her chest. She had never asked for this responsibility, had never sought to become a figure that struggling packs turned to in desperation. Yet she could not ignore the suffering in Garrick's voice, nor the genuine need reflected in the faces of those who had traveled so far seeking her help. She agreed to travel with a small group to visit the Thornwood territory, hoping that her presence, whatever its source, might offer them some measure of relief. What she discovered upon arriving days later left her both moved and unsettled. The moment she stepped onto Thornwood land, she felt an immediate shift, a warmth spreading through the ground beneath her feet that seemed to echo the strange pulse she had felt from her mark since the night of her rejection. Within hours, the perpetually gray skies over the territory began clearing. By the following morning, several hunters returned from the forest, reporting game more plentiful than they had seen in months. The villagers, initially cautious around the mysterious woman from the capital, quickly began treating her with a reverence that made Elara deeply uncomfortable, though she said nothing to discourage it, unwilling to dismiss the genuine relief visible on their faces. Garrick knelt before her on the second day of her visit, along with several senior members of his pack, formally pledging their loyalty and requesting her protection over their territory. Elara hesitated, uncertain whether accepting such a pledge crossed a line she was not prepared to cross. But the desperate hope in their eyes made refusal feel like abandoning people who genuinely needed help. "I accept your loyalty," she finally said, "not as a queen or a ruler, but as someone who will stand beside you and offer whatever aid I am able to provide. I make no promises beyond that." Word of the pledge spread quickly, reaching the capital within days, through the same merchant networks that had carried every previous rumor about the mysterious healer. Cale received the news first, delivering it to Draven with visible tension in his voice. "The Thornwood pack has formally pledged loyalty to her," Cale reported, standing before the king in the privacy of his study. "Not merely refusing tribute, Your Majesty, but openly transferring their allegiance away from the crown entirely." Draven's hands clenched into fists at his sides, though his expression remained carefully controlled. "This cannot continue. If other packs follow Thornwood's example, the kingdom's structure will begin collapsing from within, regardless of any external threat." "There is more," Cale continued reluctantly. "Reports suggest the packs pledging loyalty to her are experiencing improved conditions almost immediately. Restored crops, returning game, ended illnesses. Meanwhile, the capital continues suffering the opposite. I do not believe these are separate phenomena, Your Majesty. I believe they are directly connected, two sides of the same imbalance." Draven turned toward the window, staring out over the palace grounds, where the once vibrant gardens now showed clear signs of neglect, despite the constant efforts of the palace gardeners. Every flower planted for the approaching wedding wilted within days. The fountains, once a source of pride for the royal grounds, had begun running murky, despite regular cleaning. Even the palace itself seemed to be reflecting the fractured bond at its center, decaying slowly, while power and vitality flowed elsewhere. "What would you have me do, Cale?" he asked quietly, a rare admission of uncertainty from a king who had built his reputation on decisive strength. Cale considered his answer carefully before speaking. "I believe you already know the answer, Your Majesty. The question is whether pride will allow you to accept it before the kingdom fractures beyond repair." Draven said nothing further, dismissing Cale with a curt nod and remaining alone in his study long after the general had departed. He thought of the dream that continued visiting him nearly every night, of silver eyes watching him across a distance that felt increasingly impossible to bridge. He thought of Seraphine's honest words weeks earlier, of Beatrice's careful warnings, of the ancient texts describing consequences he had once dismissed as mere superstition. Every piece of evidence pointed toward the same uncomfortable truth, yet accepting it meant admitting a mistake in front of an entire kingdom that had watched him make his choice with absolute confidence. Meanwhile, in the Thornwood territory, Elara prepared to return to her own village, having spent nearly a week helping stabilize the pack's struggling lands. As she said her farewells to Garrick and his people, a young messenger arrived breathlessly, having traveled from a neighboring pack territory even farther south. "Please," the young man said, kneeling before her with obvious exhaustion from his journey, "my pack sent me to find you. Our alpha has fallen seriously ill, and our healers can find no cause or cure. We heard of your gift, and hoped, prayed, that you might be willing to help us as well." Elara exchanged a glance with Corwin, who had accompanied her throughout the journey, before nodding gently to the young messenger. "Rest first," she told him. "You have traveled far, and exhaustion will serve no one. We will leave for your territory, once you have regained your strength." As the messenger was led away to rest and eat, Elara found herself standing alone for a moment, gazing northward toward the direction of the capital, invisible beyond the horizon, but ever present in her thoughts despite her best efforts to move forward without looking back. She wondered, not for the first time, whether the strange power awakening within her carried any connection to the bond Draven had rejected, or whether it existed entirely independent of him, a gift she would have discovered regardless of that painful night in the Great Hall. She did not yet have an answer, but she recognized, with growing clarity, that whatever path lay ahead of her now stretched far beyond anything she could have imagined during her quiet years in Thorn Hollow, waiting for a life that had once seemed entirely out of her control. The rumors reaching the capital grew more specific with each passing week, no longer vague whispers but detailed accounts carried by traders, travelers, and even a few brave nobles who journeyed south under the guise of trade negotiations, only to return with first-hand stories of the silver-eyed healer, commanding loyalty across an expanding stretch of southern territory. Cale made it his personal mission to verify each report, sending trusted scouts, disguised as merchants, to gather accurate information, rather than relying solely on second-hand accounts that grew more exaggerated with every retelling. What his scouts confirmed troubled him deeply. Elara had indeed helped stabilize the Thornwood Pack's failing lands, and she had since traveled to at least 2 additional territories, both suffering from unexplained hardships that seemed to lift shortly after her arrival. Neither pack had been formally asked to pledge loyalty, according to the scouts' observations, yet both had done so regardless, their leaders apparently convinced that aligning themselves with her presence offered protection their allegiance to the distant capital no longer seemed to provide. Cale brought this information directly to Draven, finding him in the war room studying maps of the kingdom's territories, with an intensity that suggested he had spent considerable time there recently. Colored markers indicated which packs remained loyal to the crown, which had refused tribute, and which had openly pledged themselves elsewhere. The southern portion of the map showed a troubling pattern, an expanding cluster of markers shifting away from royal loyalty in a manner that suggested the trend was accelerating rather than slowing. 5 packs now, Draven said without looking up as Cale entered. 5 packs that have either refused tribute entirely or openly transferred their loyalty within the span of 2 months. The number will likely continue growing, Cale replied honestly, joining him at the map table. My scouts report that word of her presence continues spreading, and struggling packs across the southern territories are increasingly willing to seek her out, rather than petition the capital for assistance they no longer trust us to provide. Draven's jaw tightened as he studied the map further. The wedding is in 10 days. House Ashford has already begun arriving for the ceremony. Canceling now would not merely embarrass us diplomatically, it could provoke outright conflict with a kingdom whose alliance we still need to secure our western borders. Then perhaps the question is not whether to cancel the wedding, Cale said carefully, but whether proceeding with it will do more harm than the diplomatic consequences of delaying. Draven turned to face his general fully, frustration visible in the tension across his shoulders. You believe I should postpone my marriage to Seraphine based on rumors and superstition, risking war with House Ashford, in order to chase after an Omega who made clear she wanted nothing further to do with me? I believe, Cale said, holding his king's gaze steadily, despite the sharpness in Draven's tone, that you are asking the wrong question entirely. This is no longer merely about Elara or about your feelings toward her. This is about the survival of the kingdom you were born to protect. Every day this imbalance continues. More packs slip further from our control. More of our people suffer the consequences within these very walls, and more of our strength bleeds away toward a territory that grows stronger, precisely because ours grows weaker. Draven had no immediate response to that, the truth in Cale's words settling heavily over him. He dismissed his general and remained alone in the war room long into the evening, staring at the map until the candles burned low and shadows stretched long across the territorial markers that told a story he could no longer deny. Later that night, his wolf's restlessness finally overwhelmed his control entirely. Under the full moon rising over the palace, Draven found himself unable to maintain his usual composure, his wolf pushing against the boundaries of his human form, with a ferocity he had never before experienced. He barely made it to the private grounds behind his chambers before the shift overtook him completely, his body transforming against his will, in a manner that left him disoriented and, for the first time in years, genuinely afraid of losing control entirely. Chaol, alerted by palace guards who witnessed the unusual disturbance, arrived to find Draven in his wolf form pacing the private grounds with wild, unfocused energy, his eyes carrying a haze that suggested his human consciousness had been pushed dangerously far beneath the surface. It took nearly an hour of careful, patient presence before Draven managed to regain enough control to shift back into human form, exhausted and shaken by an experience that confirmed everything Chaol and Beatrice had been warning him about for weeks. "This has never happened before," Draven admitted quietly, sitting on the cold ground of the private courtyard, still catching his breath. "Not since my earliest years of training, when I first learned to control the shift." "The bond's imbalance grows stronger," Chaol said gently, kneeling beside him. "Your wolf recognizes what your mind refuses to accept. The longer this continues unresolved, the more difficult maintaining control will become, both for you and for the kingdom itself." Draven said nothing, staring at his hands, as though searching them for answers they could not provide. The following morning, he requested a private audience with Seraphine, finding her in the palace gardens overseeing final preparations for the wedding, despite the wilted state of nearly every flower bed surrounding her. "I owe you an honest conversation," he began, "one I should have offered weeks ago, before you invested further time and effort into a wedding I am no longer certain should proceed." Seraphine studied him carefully, showing no surprise at his words, as though she had anticipated this conversation long before he found the courage to initiate it. "You intend to seek her out," she said simply. "The Omega you rejected." "I intend to address the mistake I made," Draven replied, choosing his words carefully. "Whether that leads to reconciliation, or simply to restoring balance to my kingdom, remains uncertain. But I cannot continue moving forward with our marriage, while carrying this unresolved weight, both for your sake, and for the sake of the alliance our union is meant to strengthen." Seraphine was quiet for a long moment, her sharp eyes studying him with an expression that held neither anger nor relief, but something closer to weary understanding. "House Ashford will not react favorably to a cancelled wedding, Your Majesty. My father invested significant political capital in securing this alliance." "I understand the risk," Draven said, "and I will personally travel to speak with your father, to explain the circumstances, and to offer whatever alternative arrangement might preserve the alliance between our territories, without requiring a marriage that would ultimately weaken both our kingdoms, rather than strengthen them." Seraphine considered his words carefully, before finally nodding, a decision that surprised him, given the political complications his choice would create for her personally. "I will not pretend I am not disappointed," she admitted. "But I have watched you these past weeks, Draven, and I recognize a man fighting a battle he cannot win, through denial alone. Perhaps there is wisdom in facing that battle honestly, rather than dragging me into a marriage built upon a foundation already cracked beyond repair." Their conversation, though difficult, ended with a mutual respect neither had expected to find in each other during the tense weeks of wedding preparation. Seraphine agreed to remain at the palace while Draven traveled south, understanding that the outcome of his journey would determine not only his own future, but the shape of whatever alliance might still be salvaged between their two kingdoms. Word of the postponed wedding spread through the palace and beyond within hours, sparking fresh waves of speculation among the nobility, and further unease among the common people, already anxious about the kingdom's visible troubles. Draven ignored the whispers, focusing instead on preparing for the journey south, gathering a small contingent led by Chaol to accompany him, rather than risking a large formal procession that would only draw further attention to the uncertain nature of his mission. Before departing, he visited the palace library one final time, searching through the oldest texts for any guidance on how a rejected bond might be properly addressed once the initial rejection had already been spoken aloud before witnesses. The texts offered little practical guidance, describing the phenomenon in broad terms without detailing specific remedies, leaving Draven to understand that whatever resolution existed would likely depend entirely on the choices made by both parties involved, rather than any formal ritual or ceremony that could simply undo the damage already done. As his small contingent rode south from the capital the following morning, Draven found himself contemplating not merely how he might convince Alara to return, but whether he even had the right to ask that of her after the humiliation he had subjected her to before the entire court. He had spent weeks focused on the kingdom's stability, on the political and magical consequences of his rejection, but as the palace disappeared behind him and the southern road stretched ahead, he began to understand that any true resolution would require him to reckon honestly with the pain he had caused a woman who deserved far better than the treatment he had shown her, regardless of whatever consequences that treatment had unleashed upon his kingdom. The journey south proved far more difficult than Draven had anticipated. What should have taken his contingent 5 days stretched into nearly 8, as the roads leading through the border territories showed clear signs of the unrest Cale had described. Villages that once welcomed royal riders with open hospitality now regarded them with wary distance, some outright refusing to provide supplies or shelter, citing loyalty to territories no longer aligned with the crown. In one town, an elderly innkeeper flatly told Draven that his establishment served only those loyal to the healer of the south, a statement that struck him with unexpected force, a small but undeniable sign of how far his authority had already eroded beyond the palace walls. Cale watched his king absorb these encounters with growing concern, noting how each rejection seemed to weigh more heavily than the last, chipping away at the confident bearing Draven had carried throughout his entire reign. By the 6th day of travel, as they crossed into territory that had once belonged firmly to the crown but now flew banners of independent allegiance, Draven's wolf grew restless again, forcing frequent stops to allow him time to regain control before continuing the journey. "We should rest here for the night," Cale suggested, as dusk settled over a small clearing near the edge of a forest that marked the boundary of increasingly unfamiliar territory. "Pushing further in your current state risks losing control entirely, and that would serve no one, least of all the mission that brought us this far." Draven agreed reluctantly, and the small contingent set up camp for the evening, the fire casting long shadows across faces, tense with uncertainty about what awaited them ahead. As the others settled into their bedrolls, Draven remained awake, staring into the flames, while his mind wandered through the weeks of turmoil that had led him to this moment, riding toward a woman he had publicly humiliated, uncertain whether she would even agree to see him upon his arrival. "You are afraid," Cale observed quietly, settling beside him near the fire once the others had fallen asleep. "I am not accustomed to fear," Draven replied, though the admission in his tone contradicted the denial in his words. "I have led armies into battle without hesitation. I have faced rival alphas in single combat without flinching, yet the thought of standing before her again, of facing what I did to her honestly, unsettles me more than any battlefield ever has." "Perhaps because battlefields require only physical courage," Cale offered. "This requires something far more difficult, the courage to admit fault before someone you have wronged, without the certainty of forgiveness waiting on the other side." Draven said nothing further, but Cale's words lingered with him, long after the fire had burned down to embers. He thought of Alara's face on the night of the rejection ceremony, the careful composure she had maintained even as humiliation clearly wounded her, the quiet dignity in her final words to him before she walked away. He had told himself for weeks that his decision had been necessary, a matter of duty rather than cruelty. But sitting alone in the darkness of an unfamiliar forest, he finally allowed himself to fully acknowledge that duty had been little more than a convenient excuse, one that allowed him to avoid confronting feelings he had not been prepared to accept from an Omega, whose worth the court had taught him to dismiss before he had ever truly known her. By the following afternoon, the contingent finally reached the outskirts of the village where Alara had first settled, though scouts sent ahead reported that she had since traveled further south to assist another struggling pack, leaving Corwin and several other trusted helpers to manage the growing clinic in her absence. Draven insisted on continuing forward, despite the added delay, unwilling to turn back now that he had come this far. The village itself surprised him upon arrival. Far from the primitive settlement he had vaguely imagined during the journey, he found a thriving community, its fields lush and healthy despite the season, its people carrying themselves with a quiet confidence that seemed to reflect the stability Alara's presence had apparently restored to the region. Children played freely in the streets, elderly residents sat comfortably outside their homes rather than huddled against hardship, and the entire atmosphere carried a warmth that stood in stark contrast to the tension he had left behind at the increasingly troubled capital. Corwin approached the royal contingent cautiously as they entered the village center, recognizing immediately from the banners and bearing of the riders that this was no ordinary group of travelers. "You are far from the capital, Your Majesty," he said carefully, offering a respectful but guarded bow. "I seek Alara," Draven said directly, choosing honesty over diplomatic evasion. "I understand she has traveled further south, but I would ask for guidance to wherever she may currently be found." Corwin studied the king for a long moment, clearly weighing how much loyalty he owed to a crown that had once dismissed the woman he now served with genuine devotion. "She has done more good for these lands in a few short months than the capital managed in years of collecting tribute without offering protection in return," he finally said, his tone carrying a pointed edge despite its politeness. "I would ask what your intentions are before I offer any assistance in locating her." Kale stepped forward slightly, recognizing the tension building between the young villager and his king. "His Majesty travels not to reclaim territory or authority through force," Kale explained calmly. "He travels to address a wrong he committed against her personally, and to understand the consequences that decision has created for the kingdom as a whole." Corwin considered this explanation carefully before finally relenting, providing directions to the neighboring territory where Alara had traveled to assist the ailing Alpha, whose pack had sought her help weeks earlier. "She is a healer, not a weapon to be claimed for political convenience," Corwin added firmly, before allowing the contingent to continue their journey. "Whatever wrong you seek to address, I hope you approach it with the same respect she has shown every person who has come to her seeking help, regardless of their station or their history." The words stayed with Draven as his contingent continued their journey, a reminder from a stranger that struck deeper than he expected, highlighting just how far his own treatment of Alara had fallen short of the basic respect she deserved, respect she now received freely from people who had known her for mere months, compared to the entitled dismissal she had received from a court that should have valued her from the very beginning. As they approached the territory where Alara currently resided, word of their approach traveled ahead of them, carried by scouts and messengers who had grown accustomed to monitoring any unfamiliar riders entering the increasingly protected southern territories. By the time Draven's contingent reached the outer boundary of the Packlands, a small group of armed guards had already assembled to meet them, their stance cautious but not overtly hostile, clearly awaiting instruction on how to proceed. Among them stood Garrick, the Thornwood Alpha whose pack had been among the first to formally pledge loyalty to Alara, his weathered face showing clear recognition of the royal banners approaching. "King Draven," he said, his tone carrying neither warmth nor open hostility, but a careful neutrality that suggested he awaited further explanation before determining how to respond. "This is unexpected. I have come to speak with Alara," Draven said, dismounting from his horse to show respect, rather than addressing the pack leader from horseback. Not as a king asserting authority over territory that has chosen to align elsewhere, but as a man seeking to correct a grave mistake. Garrick studied him for a long moment, clearly weighing the sincerity behind his words against the political complications his arrival represented, for the fragile balance the southern territories had established. "She is currently tending to my Alpha's illness in the main hall," he finally said. "I will escort you personally, but I offer this warning freely. She has built something meaningful here, something these people depend upon and trust. Whatever occurs during your conversation with her, I would ask that you remember the weight her presence now carries for lands far beyond the palace you left behind." Draven nodded solemnly, understanding the warning for exactly what it represented, not merely protection of a woman these people had come to respect, but recognition of how deeply the consequences of his earlier decision now extended into lives and communities that had nothing to do with the original rejection ceremony that had set everything into motion. As Garrick led him toward the main hall, Draven felt his heart pounding, with an intensity that rivaled any battle he had ever faced, keenly aware that whatever happened in the coming moments would determine not merely his personal future, but the fate of an entire kingdom hanging delicately in the balance. Inside the main hall, Alara knelt beside a bed where an elderly Alpha named Osric lay pale and weak, his breathing shallow despite hours of careful treatment. She pressed her palm gently against his chest, focusing the strange warmth that had become second nature to her over the past months, watching as color slowly began returning to his face. The gathered pack members watched in tense silence, having witnessed this same process bring relief to countless others, but never entirely losing their sense of wonder at the sight of it. She did not hear the door open, too focused on the delicate work before her, and it was only when the room fell into a deeper, more charged silence that she finally looked up, her hand still resting against Osric's chest. Standing in the doorway, flanked by Garrick and several members of his own guard, stood Draven, his expression carrying none of the cold detachment she remembered from the rejection ceremony, replaced instead by something far more vulnerable that she struggled to immediately identify. Her breath caught, though she quickly composed herself, finishing her work with Osric before rising to her feet and facing the man who had once stood before an entire kingdom and declared her unworthy of his bond. "This is unexpected," she said carefully, echoing Garrick's earlier words without realizing it, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions the sight of him stirred within her. "I know I have no right to ask for your time," Draven said, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it, stripped of the commanding authority that had defined every previous interaction between them. "But I have traveled a long distance, seeking the chance to speak with you honestly, if you are willing to grant it." The gathered pack members exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to remain or offer privacy for whatever conversation was about to unfold. Garrick made the decision for them, gently ushering everyone from the hall, while assuring Alara through a meaningful glance that he and his guards would remain close by, should she require anything at all. Within moments, the hall emptied entirely, leaving only Draven and Alara standing amid the quiet aftermath of a healing that had for the moment been entirely overshadowed by the weight of their reunion. "You look well," Draven said, though the words felt inadequate the instant he spoke them. "I am well," Alara replied simply. "Better than I have been in a long time, in fact." An uncomfortable silence stretched between them, filled with everything unspoken since that painful night months earlier. Finally, Draven took a step closer, though he stopped himself before closing the distance entirely, respecting whatever boundary she might need. "I came to apologize," he said, "truly apologize, not for political convenience, or because my kingdom now suffers the consequences of my decision, but because what I did to you was cruel, and you deserved far better than the treatment I gave you that night." Alara studied him carefully, searching his face for any sign of the calculated politician she had feared might be standing before her, someone seeking only to repair his kingdom's stability, rather than genuinely reckoning with the pain he had caused her. What she found instead surprised her, a rawness in his expression that seemed entirely unguarded, unlike the composed king she remembered from the palace. "Why did you reject me?" she asked, the question she had carried with her every day since that night finally given voice. "Truly reject me, not the political explanation you offered the court, but the real reason." Draven was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with an honest answer rather than reaching for another convenient excuse. "I was afraid," he finally admitted. "Afraid of a bond I had not chosen. Afraid of vulnerability I had spent my entire life avoiding. Afraid that caring for someone as deeply as the bond demanded would make me weak in the eyes of a court that has always valued strength above all else. I told myself the alliance with House Ashford was necessary, and perhaps politically it offered certain advantages, but the truth is, I used that alliance as a shield to avoid facing feelings I did not know how to handle." His honesty struck her more deeply than any calculated apology could have, the admission carrying a weight that suggested genuine reflection rather than mere political necessity. Still, the memory of standing alone in that great hall, humiliated before hundreds of witnesses, was not something a single honest confession could simply erase. "You made your choice in front of the entire kingdom," she said, her voice carrying quiet steel, despite the vulnerability beneath it. "You did not merely reject a bond, Draven. You rejected me, publicly, in the cruelest way possible, and then moved forward, with plans to marry another woman, as though I had never mattered at all." "I know," Draven said, and to his credit, he did not attempt to minimize or excuse the reality of what he had done. "I cannot undo that night, no matter how deeply I regret it now. I can only tell you that I have spent every day since watching the consequences of that choice unfold, both within my kingdom and within myself, and I have come to understand, far too late, exactly what I threw away that night." Alara turned away from him slightly, moving toward the window where afternoon light filtered gently across the room, giving herself a moment to process the weight of his words before responding. "I have built something here," she said quietly, something entirely my own, built not from a bond forced upon me by fate, but from choices I made freely, once I finally had the freedom to make them. I am no longer the quiet Omega who stood silently before your court, hoping desperately for acceptance that never came. I can see that, Draven said, moving to stand beside her near the window, close enough to speak intimately, but careful to maintain respectful distance. And it is precisely that strength, that transformation, that makes me realize how wrong I was to dismiss you as unworthy in the first place. You were never unworthy, Alara. I simply lacked the courage to recognize your worth when it mattered most. She said nothing for a long moment, watching the sunlight play across the village below, where children continued playing in the streets, unaware of the conversation unfolding that could reshape the future of their entire region. Finally, she turned back to face him fully. The kingdom suffers because of what you did, she said. Not merely my personal pain, but genuine instability that has spread far beyond the palace walls. Packs have fractured. Your own wolf struggles for control. These are not simply metaphors for heartbreak, Draven. These are real consequences affecting real lives. I understand that now, Draven replied. Kael and Beatrice have both explained the connection between the bond and the kingdom's stability. I did not come here merely to seek your forgiveness for my own sake. I came because I finally understand that resolving this matter, one way or another, has become necessary for the survival of everyone I am sworn to protect. His words, while honest, carried an unintended sting that Alara immediately recognized. So this is about the kingdom then, she said, her tone cooling slightly. Not truly about me, but about the political and magical consequences my absence has created for your throne. No, Draven said quickly, more firmly than he had spoken since arriving. It began that way. I will not lie to you about that. The unrest at the borders and the troubles within the palace first forced me to confront what I had done. But somewhere during this journey south, watching the villages I passed through, listening to how deeply your presence has already changed the lives of people who once had nothing, I realized that my desire to see you again has become about far more than restoring political stability. I have missed you, Alara, in ways I did not expect and did not know how to name until I found myself standing here before you now. Alara studied him carefully, searching for any hint of deception in his expression, but found only the same raw honesty that had surprised her since he first entered the hall. Still, months of building a life independent of the palace, of proving to herself that she did not need royal validation to find purpose and belonging, had changed her in ways that could not simply be undone by a heartfelt apology, however genuine it might be. I need time, she finally said. Time to consider what any of this means, both for myself and for the people who now depend on the stability my presence has helped provide. I will not simply abandon what I have built here to return to a palace that once made clear I did not belong within its walls. Draven nodded, understanding that pushing further in this moment would only undermine whatever fragile progress their conversation had achieved. I will respect whatever time you need, he said. I only ask that you consider the full weight of what continues happening, both to my kingdom and to the growing division between the territories still loyal to the crown and those that have shifted their allegiance toward you. Whatever choice you eventually make, I hope it comes from clarity, rather than urgency, forced upon you by circumstances neither of us fully controls. As Draven departed the hall to allow Alara space to process their conversation, neither of them could have anticipated how quickly circumstances beyond their control would soon force the very urgency he had hoped to avoid. As tensions building along the kingdom's fractured borders finally reached a breaking point that would leave no room for the careful, measured resolution either of them had hoped to find. While Draven remained in the southern territories awaiting Alara's decision, disturbing news arrived from the capital that shattered any hope of a peaceful resolution unfolding at a measured pace. A messenger, having ridden through the night without rest, delivered word to Kael that a rival alpha from the eastern mountains, a fierce and ambitious leader named Roderick, had begun mobilizing his own forces along the kingdom's eastern border, apparently sensing an opportunity in the visible instability plaguing the crown. Roderick had long resented the authority Vermore held over territories he believed rightfully belonged to independent eastern clans, and the growing fractures within the kingdom, combined with reports of the king's own wolf struggling for control, presented an opening he had clearly been waiting years to exploit. Scouts reported his forces gathering in numbers far exceeding routine border patrols, a clear sign of preparation for something far more aggressive than mere posturing. "This changes everything," Cale said grimly, showing the report to Draven, as they stood together outside the hall, where Alara continued tending to Osric's recovery. "Roderick has waited his entire life for an opportunity like this. If he believes the kingdom's foundation has weakened sufficiently, he will not hesitate to strike while the crown remains distracted by internal division." Draven's expression hardened, the vulnerability he had shown during his conversation with Alara giving way once more to the sharp focus of a king facing genuine external threat. "How many forces has he gathered?" "Enough to concern us seriously," Cale replied, "and that number continues growing daily. If the southern pacts that have already shifted their loyalty away from the crown choose to remain neutral rather than support us against Roderick's advance, or worse, if they choose to actively oppose us given their grievances, our position becomes considerably more precarious." The weight of this new development settled heavily over Draven, forcing him to confront a reality far more urgent than the careful, patient reconciliation he had hoped to pursue with Alara. A kingdom fractured internally could not withstand external aggression, and every day spent awaiting a personal resolution represented time Roderick could use to further strengthen his position along the vulnerable eastern border. He requested an urgent meeting with Alara that same afternoon, finding her resting briefly after hours spent tending to Osric and several other villagers who had sought her help throughout the day. She could see immediately from his expression that something significant had changed since their previous conversation. "Roderick moves against the eastern border," Draven explained without preamble, understanding that circumstances no longer allowed for the careful diplomacy he had intended to maintain. "He believes the kingdom's internal fractures make us vulnerable to conquest. If the southern territories remain divided from the crown, or worse, choose to oppose us entirely, we may face a threat severe enough to reshape the entire realm." Alara absorbed this information with visible concern, understanding immediately the gravity of what he described. "What are you asking of me?" she said directly, recognizing that whatever request he was building toward carried implications far beyond their personal history. "I am not asking you to return to the palace as my queen, not yet, not unless that becomes something you genuinely choose, rather than something circumstances force upon you," Draven said carefully. "But the pacts that have pledged loyalty to you hold real strength. Strength this kingdom desperately needs, if we are to face Roderick's forces without catastrophic loss of life. I am asking whether you would be willing to help unite these fractured territories, not for my sake, but for the sake of every person who will suffer if this conflict spreads unchecked across the realm." His request carried a painful irony that was not lost on either of them, the very strength born from his rejection of her now potentially serving as the kingdom's salvation, against an entirely different threat. Alara considered his words carefully, weighing the responsibility of the pledges made to her against the very real danger that a fractured kingdom now faced. "The people who pledged loyalty to me did so believing I offered them protection and stability that the crown had failed to provide," she finally said. "If I ask them to align with the very throne that once dismissed them and me, I need assurance that alignment will not simply return them to a system that ignores their needs once the immediate crisis passes." "You have my word," Draven said firmly, "and more than my word, I am prepared to formalize whatever protections and representation these territories require to ensure their needs are genuinely addressed going forward, regardless of how our own personal history resolves itself. This is no longer merely about us, Alara. This is about preventing a war that could cost countless lives across every territory in this realm, loyal to the crown or otherwise." Alara studied him for a long moment, recognizing the sincerity in his words, while also understanding the enormous responsibility such a decision would place upon her. She thought of Osric, recovering peacefully in the next room, because she had chosen to help despite having no formal obligation to do so. She thought of the children playing freely in villages that had once suffered under hardship and uncertainty. Whatever her personal feelings toward Draven, the safety of these communities mattered more than any lingering resentment she carried from the rejection ceremony months earlier. "I will help," she finally said, "not because I have forgiven what happened between us, and not because I am prepared to simply return to the life I once had at the palace. I will help because innocent people will suffer if this conflict escalates, and I refuse to let my own personal history stand in the way of preventing that suffering." Relief and gratitude flooded Draven's expression, though he was careful not to overstate what her decision meant for their personal relationship, understanding that her choice reflected her own values, rather than any renewed commitment to him specifically. "Thank you," he said simply. "I will not forget this, regardless of how everything else between us eventually resolves." Over the following days, Alara traveled with Garrick and representatives from several allied pacts to meet with other territorial leaders across the southern region, explaining the threat Roderick's forces posed, and the necessity of presenting a united front against external aggression, regardless of internal grievances against the crown. Her presence and the trust she had built over the preceding months proved instrumental in these negotiations, as pack leaders who might have dismissed a royal envoy outright listened carefully to arguments presented by someone they had come to genuinely respect and trust. Not every meeting proceeded smoothly, however. Several pacts remained deeply skeptical of any arrangement that involved renewed cooperation with the crown, their grievances too fresh and too significant to be easily set aside, even in the face of external threat. One particularly tense negotiation with a pack leader named Thane, whose territory had suffered severely under previous tax burdens imposed by the capital, nearly collapsed entirely before Alara intervened personally. "I understand your anger," she told Thane directly, standing before his assembled council in a meeting hall, far less welcoming than the one she had grown accustomed to in Thornwood. "I have felt the sting of the crown's dismissal myself, more intimately than perhaps anyone in this room, but allowing that anger to prevent us from addressing a threat that will show no mercy to any of us, loyal or otherwise, only ensures that Roderick's forces sweep through territories left vulnerable by our division. Whatever grievances exist against the crown can and should be addressed once this immediate danger passes, but addressing them requires that we survive long enough to have that conversation at all." Her words, carrying the weight of genuine shared experience rather than distant political rhetoric, ultimately persuaded Thane and his council to join the growing coalition, forming to face the eastern threat. By the end of the week, nearly every southern territory that had previously shifted loyalty away from the crown had agreed, at minimum, to a temporary alliance against Roderick's forces, their combined strength representing a formidable addition to whatever forces Draven could muster from territories still directly loyal to the throne. As this fragile coalition began taking shape, reports continued arriving that painted an increasingly urgent picture of Roderick's advance. His forces had begun probing attacks against smaller border settlements, testing the kingdom's response, and gathering intelligence for what scouts believed would soon become a full-scale invasion, aimed at claiming territory, while the kingdom remained internally divided. Time, once again, had become the enemy of careful diplomacy, forcing both Draven and Alara to accept that whatever remained unresolved between them personally would need to wait until the more immediate threat to countless innocent lives had been properly addressed. Within 2 weeks, the coalition Alara had helped forge stood ready to march toward the eastern border, joining forces with the royal army that Draven had summoned from every territory still directly loyal to the crown. The combined force, while impressive in number, remained an uneasy alliance, soldiers from formerly divided territories eyeing each other with lingering suspicion even as they prepared to fight side by side against a common threat. Draven had returned briefly to the capital to organize the royal forces and coordinate logistics, leaving Kael to maintain communication with the Southern Coalition, while Alara continued working to ensure the alliance held firm, despite the inevitable tensions arising from decades of political grievance now set aside for practical necessity. Seraphine, who had remained at the palace throughout these developments, proved unexpectedly valuable during this period, her sharp political instincts helping smooth negotiations between wary pack leaders and royal commanders unaccustomed to treating former rivals as equal partners. "You have a talent for this," Draven admitted to her one evening as they reviewed troop deployments together in the war room, the map now marked with both royal and coalition forces preparing to converge against Roderick's advancing army. "Diplomacy has always been my strength," Seraphine replied, studying the map with practiced focus. "Though I confess, Your Majesty, watching this unlikely alliance take shape has taught me more about genuine leadership than years of court politics ever managed to reveal." Their working relationship, though no longer bound by the expectation of marriage, had settled into a genuine mutual respect that neither had anticipated when Seraphine first arrived, for what everyone had assumed would become a straightforward political union. House Ashford, upon learning of the postponed wedding, had initially reacted with predictable anger, But Draven's personal visit to explain the circumstances, combined with an alternative trade agreement offering equivalent benefits without requiring marriage, had ultimately preserved the alliance in a form that satisfied both parties, without forcing an ill-fitted union that would have satisfied no one. As the combined forces marched toward the eastern border, Elara traveled among the coalition ranks, her presence serving not merely a symbolic purpose, but a practical one as well, her healing abilities proving invaluable for treating injuries among scouts who had already encountered skirmishes with Roderick's advance forces. She worked alongside Beatrice, who had traveled from the palace specifically to coordinate medical support for the gathering army, the two healers forming a quick and effective partnership despite their vastly different backgrounds and experiences. "You have quite a gift," Beatrice observed one evening as they worked together, treating wounded scouts brought in from a border skirmish. "I have served this kingdom for 30 years, and never witnessed healing abilities quite like yours." "I did not always have this gift," Elara admitted, focusing her attention on a deep wound across a young scout's shoulder. "It emerged only after the rejection, as though something within me needed to find purpose beyond what I had always been told I was worth." Beatrice studied her carefully, recognizing in Elara's words an echo of the ancient texts she had studied extensively over recent months. "The old stories speak of Omegas, whose true strength remains hidden until circumstances force it to emerge," she said thoughtfully. "Perhaps the rejection, painful as it was, revealed something within you that might have remained dormant otherwise, had you simply been accepted without challenge from the beginning." Elara considered this perspective as she finished treating the young scout's wound, watching him thank her with genuine gratitude before returning to his unit. She had spent months building an identity, independent of the palace, and the bond that had once defined her entire worth in the eyes of the court. Yet standing here now, surrounded by soldiers from territories both loyal and formerly estranged from the crown, all working together toward a common purpose she had helped make possible, she recognized that her strength had never truly been separate from what happened that painful night. It had been forged by it, transformed through the fire of rejection, into something far more powerful than the quiet acceptance she had once hoped to find. Word soon arrived that Roderick's forces had breached the eastern border, more aggressively than anticipated, overwhelming a smaller garrison stationed at a fortress town called Ridgemore, before the main coalition forces could arrive to reinforce the position. The news struck the assembled army hard, the reality of genuine warfare replacing what had until now remained largely theoretical preparation and strategic planning. Draven called an urgent council among the coalition leaders, including Garrick, Thane, and several other pack representatives, whose forces now marched alongside the royal army. "Ridgemore has fallen," he announced grimly, watching the news settle heavily across the assembled faces. "Roderick's forces show no sign of slowing their advance. We must move quickly to prevent further towns from suffering the same fate." "How many casualties at Ridgemore?" Thane asked, his voice carrying genuine concern despite his earlier skepticism toward the crown. "Reports remain incomplete," Cale answered honestly, "but early accounts suggest significant loss of life among both the garrison and the civilian population who did not evacuate in time." The grim news settled over the assembled council, transforming what had until now felt like a distant, almost theoretical threat into an urgent reality that demanded immediate and decisive action. Garrick, whose own territory bordered the region Roderick's forces threatened next, spoke with fierce determination. "My people will not stand by while another town suffers the same fate as Ridgemore. Whatever grievances remain between our territories and the crown, we fight alongside you now, without hesitation." His words, echoed by nods of agreement from the other coalition leaders present, confirmed that whatever fragile trust Elara had helped build over the preceding weeks now held firm in the face of genuine shared danger. The combined forces reorganized their strategy, moving with greater urgency toward intercepting Roderick's advance before it could threaten additional settlements along the vulnerable eastern territories. As preparations for the coming confrontation intensified, Draven found a rare private moment with Elara the evening before the coalition forces expected to engage Roderick's army directly. They stood together near the edge of the camp, the distant glow of campfires casting flickering light across faces tense with anticipation of the battle ahead. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Draven said quietly, "I want you to know that watching you these past weeks, watching the strength and compassion you have shown to people who owe you nothing, has taught me more about true leadership than every lesson I received during my years of formal training, to become king." Elara turned to look at him, searching his expression in the dim firelight for any trace of the cold, dismissive man who had once stood before an entire court and rejected her without hesitation. She found instead someone genuinely humbled by everything that had unfolded since that painful night, a man who had begun to understand, however belatedly, the true weight of the choices he had made. "Tomorrow will test everything this coalition has built," she said carefully, choosing not to address the emotional weight behind his words directly, uncertain whether she was yet ready to fully process what she felt toward him. "Let us focus on ensuring we survive it, and worry about everything else once the immediate danger has passed." Draven nodded, respecting her measured response, even as something in his chest ached at the careful distance she still maintained between them. As dawn approached and the coalition forces prepared to march toward their confrontation with Roderick's advancing army, neither of them could yet know whether the alliance they had built, both political and personal, would prove strong enough to withstand the trials that awaited them in the battles to come. The coalition forces met Roderick's army on the open plains, just beyond the fallen town of Ridgemore, the two forces facing each other, across a wide field that would soon become the deciding ground for the kingdom's future stability. Draven rode at the head of the royal forces, with Kael commanding the eastern flank, and Garrick leading the coalition warriors, who had traveled from the southern territories to stand against a threat that ultimately endangered every corner of the realm, regardless of past loyalties. Roderick himself proved every bit as formidable as the reports had suggested, a towering alpha whose reputation for ruthless ambition had clearly been well earned. He rode forward alone to meet Draven partway across the field, both leaders recognizing the importance of a final attempt at communication before the inevitable violence began. "You have gathered quite a coalition, Draven," Roderick observed, his tone carrying open mockery despite the respect underlying his acknowledgement of the assembled forces. "Packs that were tearing themselves away from your throne, mere weeks ago, now stand beside you. Interesting how quickly desperation reshapes loyalty." "Their loyalty was earned through respect, not desperation," Draven replied evenly, refusing to rise to the provocation. "Something you might understand better if you had spent less time exploiting perceived weakness and more time building genuine alliances of your own." Roderick's expression hardened at the retort, any pretense of civil negotiation clearly abandoned. "Weakness is precisely what I intend to exploit today. Your kingdom has spent months fracturing from within, your own wolf reportedly struggling for basic control. I offer you one final chance to withdraw your forces and cede the eastern territories peacefully, sparing further bloodshed on both sides." "I will not abandon my people to your ambition," Draven said firmly, "regardless of whatever weaknesses my kingdom has faced in recent months. We stand united today, and we will defend every territory you threaten." Roderick's only response was a cold smile, before he turned his horse and rode back toward his own forces, the brief negotiation having accomplished nothing beyond confirming that battle remained the only path forward. Draven returned to his own lines, meeting Elara's gaze briefly where she waited among the healers, positioned safely behind the front ranks, her expression carrying quiet strength, despite the fear evident beneath it. The battle that followed tested every ounce of unity the coalition had managed to build over the preceding weeks. Roderick's forces struck with disciplined ferocity, clearly having prepared extensively for this confrontation, and for the first hours, the outcome remained uncertain, as both sides suffered significant losses across the sprawling battlefield. Kael's eastern flank held firm against repeated assaults, his years of military experience proving invaluable in coordinating the coalition warriors who had never before fought alongside royal forces in any organized capacity. Elara worked tirelessly throughout the battle, moving among the wounded brought back from the front lines, her healing abilities stretched to their absolute limit as she treated soldier after soldier, both from royal forces and coalition territories alike, refusing to distinguish between them despite the exhausting toll such continuous effort demanded. Beatrice worked alongside her, the two healers forming an efficient rhythm that saved countless lives that might otherwise have been lost to injuries that would have proven fatal without their combined skill. As the battle stretched into its second hour, a critical moment arrived when Roderick himself led a direct assault against the center of the coalition lines, apparently recognizing that breaking this particular section would fracture the fragile unity holding the combined forces together. Draven moved to intercept him personally, understanding that allowing Roderick to break through at this crucial juncture could unravel everything the coalition had fought to achieve. Their confrontation proved fierce, both alphas fighting with the desperate intensity of leaders who understood the stakes extended far beyond their personal survival. Draven's wolf, which had struggled for control throughout the preceding weeks, found unexpected stability in the heat of genuine battle, as though the clarity of purpose in defending his people against Roderick's aggression provided the anchor his fractured bond had been lacking. He fought with a focus and determination that surprised even Kale, who observed the confrontation from a distance while managing his own section of the battlefield. The turning point came when Garrick's forces, having successfully repelled a secondary assault on the coalition's western flank, arrived to reinforce the center, just as Roderick's attack threatened to overwhelm Draven's position. The combined pressure of Royal and Coalition forces fighting together finally broke the momentum of Roderick's assault, forcing his army into a gradual retreat that, while not yet a complete rout, signaled a decisive shift in the battle's trajectory. Roderick, recognizing the changing tide, ultimately called for his forces to withdraw entirely, rather than risk complete destruction, his ambitious campaign ending not in the triumphant conquest he had envisioned, but in a costly retreat that would take years for his territory to recover from fully. As his forces retreated across the eastern border, the coalition warriors and royal soldiers alike erupted in exhausted but genuine relief, the immediate threat finally repelled through their combined effort. In the aftermath, as healers continued treating the wounded, and soldiers began the somber task of honoring those who had fallen during the confrontation, Draven found Elara resting briefly near the medical tents, her exhaustion evident despite the relief visible in her expression at the battle's successful conclusion. "We held," he said simply, sitting beside her as the setting sun cast long shadows across the battlefield behind them. "We held," she agreed, though at significant cost. "I fear the true weight of today's losses will not be fully understood until the count of the fallen is complete." Draven nodded solemnly, understanding that whatever victory they had achieved carried genuine sacrifice that could not be dismissed simply because the outcome had favored the coalition rather than Roderick's ambitions. "None of this would have been possible without you," he said quietly. "The coalition, the willingness of these territories to stand beside forces they had every reason to distrust, all of it traces back to the trust you built with these people over these past months. It traces back to their own courage and their own choice to prioritize shared safety over lingering grievance," Elara corrected gently, though she did not entirely dismiss the role she had played in making that choice possible. "But yes, I am grateful that whatever trust I managed to build proved strong enough to hold when it mattered most." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the last light of day faded across a battlefield that had witnessed both terrible loss and unexpected unity in equal measure. Finally, Draven spoke again, his voice carrying a vulnerability that matched the raw honesty he had shown during their earlier conversation in Osric's hall. "I understand if what happened between us cannot simply be undone by everything we have accomplished together these past weeks," he said. "But I want you to know that whatever choice you make going forward, regarding the kingdom, regarding myself, I will honor it fully, without expectation or pressure. You have earned the right to choose your own path, free from any obligation my earlier mistakes might otherwise have placed upon you." Elara studied him carefully in the fading light, recognizing in his words a genuine transformation from the man who had once stood coldly before an entire court and dismissed her without hesitation. The battle they had just survived together, the coalition they had built through shared purpose rather than forced obligation, had revealed a version of Draven she had not known existed beneath the rigid duty and pride that had defined his earlier actions. "I need to think," she finally said, though her tone carried less distance than it had during their previous conversations, "but I no longer believe that thinking requires me to remain entirely separate from what happens next, both for the kingdom and for whatever remains between us." It was not a promise of reconciliation, but it was, Draven recognized, the first genuine opening she had offered since his arrival in the Southern Territories weeks earlier. A small but meaningful shift that suggested the painful journey both of them had traveled since that fateful rejection ceremony might yet lead toward a resolution neither had dared hope for during the darkest days of the kingdom's fracturing instability. In the weeks following the battle against Roderick's forces, the kingdom of Veremore began a slow but steady process of healing that mirrored, in many ways, the personal reconciliation still unfolding between Draven and Elara. The coalition forged in urgent necessity did not simply dissolve once the immediate threat had passed, as many had expected, but instead evolved into a genuine restructuring of how the crown related to the territories that had once felt dismissed and undervalued. Draven, working closely with Kael and, increasingly, with Elara herself, established new agreements with each of the southern pacts, formalizing representation and protections that addressed the very grievances that had driven them to seek allegiance elsewhere in the first place. Garrick and Thane, along with other coalition leaders, participated directly in these negotiations, ensuring that whatever new structure emerged reflected genuine partnership rather than a simple return to the old system that had left them feeling neglected for so long. Seraphine, whose alternative trade agreement with House Ashford had successfully preserved the alliance between their kingdoms, without requiring the marriage neither of them ultimately wanted, remained involved in the kingdom's affairs as a trusted advisor, her sharp political instincts proving invaluable during the delicate negotiations required to formalize the new coalition structure. She and Draven had settled into a genuine friendship built on mutual respect, free from the pressure and expectation that had once defined their forced engagement. The palace itself began showing signs of recovery as the weeks passed, the wilted gardens gradually returning to health, the restless wolves finally settling into peaceful rest, the strange illnesses that had plagued the staff fading entirely as the underlying imbalance that had caused them slowly resolved itself. Beatrice observed these changes with quiet satisfaction, understanding better than most the deep connection between the kingdom's stability and the state of the bond that had once been so carelessly rejected. Elara divided her time between the southern territories, where her ongoing presence continued providing stability and healing to communities that had come to depend on her, and increasingly frequent visits to the capital, where she worked alongside Draven and his council to ensure the new coalition structure served everyone fairly. These visits, initially formal and businesslike, gradually softened into something warmer, as the genuine partnership they had built during the crisis continued deepening into something that echoed, though did not simply replicate, the bond the moon goddess had originally chosen for them. "You have changed this kingdom more than any king in generations," Draven told her one evening, as they walked together through gardens that had finally returned to their former vibrant health, the flowers blooming with a resilience that seemed to reflect the broader healing taking place throughout the realm. "We have changed it," Elara corrected gently, though a small smile suggested she appreciated the sentiment behind his words. This was never something either of us could have accomplished alone. The coalition, the renewed trust between the crown and the territories, all of it required both of us, working alongside people who refused to give up on the possibility of something better. Draven stopped walking, turning to face her fully in the soft evening light. "I know I do not deserve a second chance," he said, his voice carrying the same raw honesty that had first begun breaking down the walls between them during their reunion in Osric's Hall. "I rejected you before an entire court, and no amount of subsequent effort can fully erase the pain that decision caused you. But I love you, Elara, not because the bond demands it, and not merely because your strength has helped save this kingdom from collapse, but because of who you have shown yourself to be through every difficult choice you have made since that terrible night. I am asking, not as your king, but simply as a man who has come to recognize what he nearly lost forever, whether you might be willing to give us a chance to build something new, something chosen freely by both of us, rather than simply assigned by fate." Elara felt tears gathering in her eyes, though for the first time since that painful rejection ceremony, they carried no trace of sorrow, only the overwhelming weight of a journey that had transformed her from a quiet, uncertain Omega into a woman who had discovered strength and purpose she never knew she possessed. She thought of everything the past months had taught her, of the communities she had helped heal, of the coalition she had helped build, of the man standing before her now who bore little resemblance to the cold king who had once dismissed her so cruelly. "I am not the same woman who stood before your court that night," she said softly. "I will never again be someone who waits quietly for acceptance that may never come. Whatever we build together now must be built as equals, with my voice carrying the same weight as yours, in matters both of the heart and of the kingdom we would share." "I would want nothing less," Draven replied immediately, the sincerity in his voice unmistakable. "But you have taught me, through everything that has happened since I made the greatest mistake of my life, that true strength lies not in rigid authority or inherited duty, but in the courage to admit fault, to grow beyond old patterns, and to build something better through genuine partnership rather than assumed hierarchy. Elara reached out, taking his hand gently, feeling the familiar warmth of the bond between them pulse with a renewed strength that felt entirely different from the desperate, unstable energy that had plagued the kingdom during the months of their separation. This connection, forged now through mutual choice rather than simple fate, carried a steadiness that promised genuine partnership rather than the fragile arrangement that had shattered so completely on the night of her rejection. "Then let us build it," she said, "together, and on our own terms." Word of their reconciliation spread quickly through both the capital and the southern territories, met not with the rigid formality that had characterized the original rejection ceremony, but with genuine celebration from people who had witnessed firsthand the transformation both Draven and Elara had undergone throughout the preceding months. When the formal ceremony finally took place months later, it bore little resemblance to the tense, politically calculated event that had once seen Draven publicly reject the bond meant to unite them. Instead, representatives from every corner of the kingdom gathered, including Garrick, Thane, and leaders from territories that had once felt entirely disconnected from the crown, all present to witness a union built on genuine partnership rather than obligation. Elara stood before the assembled crowd, no longer the quiet, uncertain Omega who had once trembled beneath the weight of a court's judgment, but a woman whose strength and compassion had helped reshape an entire kingdom's understanding of true leadership. Draven stood beside her, no longer the rigid king clinging to outdated notions of duty and strength, but a ruler who had learned, through painful and humbling experience, that genuine authority grows from humility, partnership, and the courage to acknowledge one's deepest mistakes. As the moon rose over the gathered crowd, casting silver light across the palace grounds that had fully returned to vibrant health, Draven took Elara's hand before the entire kingdom, this time not to reject the bond between them, but to embrace it fully, publicly, and without reservation. "Before this kingdom, and before the goddess who first joined us," he declared, his voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd, "I claim Elara, not as an obligation forced upon me by fate, but as my chosen partner, my equal in every sense, and the true queen this realm has always needed." The crowd erupted in genuine celebration, a stark contrast to the shocked silence that had once greeted his rejection so many months earlier. Elara looked out across the faces gathered before her, recognizing among them the people whose lives had been touched by the journey that had brought her to this moment, and felt, for the first time since that painful night in the Great Hall, a sense of complete and unwavering belonging. The kingdom of Veremore, once fractured by pride and fear, had been rebuilt not through conquest or forced authority, but through genuine partnership between a king humbled by his own mistakes and an Omega who had discovered, through rejection and hardship, a strength that ultimately proved capable of holding an entire realm together. Their story, one that had begun with humiliation and near catastrophe, had transformed into something far more powerful, a testament to the possibility of growth, reconciliation, and love, built not upon fate alone, but upon the harder, more meaningful foundation of choices made freely, again and again, until trust was fully and rightfully earned.